The exciting story begins by showing a man named Dean who is sitting in a cafe, drinking coffee. In front of Dean is a waitress named Nancy, who was a childhood friend of his. She used to work here, and Dean would come to the cafe to chat with her. As Dean is drinking his coffee, he calls Nancy over to him, but Nancy completely ignores him and goes into the kitchen. Dean couldn't understand why Nancy's behavior had changed so drastically, so he followed her into the kitchen to see what was going on. As soon as Dean opened the door, he suddenly saw a dangerous creature with large claws, which attacked him with those claws. Dean raised his hands to defend himself, but he received a severe cut on his hand. He was very scared, but when he opened his eyes, he realized that he was still sitting in his place, meaning that everything was just a nightmare he had imagined. The shocking part was that despite it being a nightmare, the cut mark was still present on his hand, indicating that somehow the nightmare was real and was affecting his body. Dean couldn't understand this because he had experienced similar nightmares in the past. Inside the cafe, another lady named Chris came in, and her boyfriend named Jossie was sitting with his friends at the same spot. When Jossie saw that his ex-girlfriend Chris was talking to Dean, he became very angry and left the place, abandoning his friends. It was revealed that Dean and Chris knew each other from high school. Dean shared his troubles with Chris, explaining his nightmares that were troubling him, and he couldn't understand how these things were possible. Chris advised Dean to stay calm as these things might affect his health. Dean understood this and tried to explain something to Chris, but then he accidentally dropped a coffee cup, spilling coffee on Chris and ruining her dress. Because of this, Chris went to the restroom. Dean apologized profusely and remained at the spot. However, once again, he began experiencing frightening nightmares, where he saw the same dangerous creature. And now the creature with sharp claws was advancing to take Dean's life, holding a knife to his throat and preparing to finish him off. A little while later, when Chris came near Dean, she was shocked to see that Dean was cutting his own throat with his own hands. Before anyone could react, Dean had done this to himself and died on the spot. The next day, people were gathered for Dean's funeral. Among them, Chris was the most shocked because she had witnessed how Dean had killed himself. After the funeral, Chris saw a younger version of herself, and when this younger version turned towards her, Chris noticed that the same claw marks were present on her body that had terrified Dean. Chris immediately came to her senses and realized that she had also seen this nightmare. She was unable to understand where these visions were coming from. After everyone had left, Chris came to the place where many of Dean's childhood photos were displayed. Among these photos, Chris suddenly noticed a picture of her own childhood with Dean, indicating that Dean and Chris knew each other from before. At that moment, Chris's ex-boyfriend Jossie arrived. Chris told Jossie everything about how Dean had killed himself and the strange visions she had been experiencing, in which Dean was trying to escape from something. However, Jossie did not believe any of this because he had not seen it with his own eyes. Then Nancy, who was also present at the cafe, came and confirmed that she had witnessed the incident with her own eyes and that Chris's statements were entirely accurate. She explained that Jossie had left to avoid further distressing his ex-girlfriend, as it was for the best and Chris should not dwell on it too much, as it could affect her health. Now, Chris was shown at her home, looking at her childhood photos, searching for answers to some questions that she could only find by looking at these photos. Chris asked her mother where her childhood belongings were, and her mother replied that she had hidden everything in the upstairs room and that it would be difficult to find. There were many items present there. After dinner with her family, everyone went to bed, but Chris wanted to uncover the truth. She immediately went to the upstairs room and began searching for her childhood things. She found all the photos and also the dress she used to wear as a child. However, the dress had the same claw marks that she had seen in her funeral vision. This suggested that these things were somehow connected to reality and nightmares. Even though the nightmares were just dreams, their impact was real, and this might be why Dean was killed. As Chris was contemplating this, an unknown man suddenly jumped on her. He was the same man who had killed Dean. In her nightmares, his entire body was burned, and he had sharp claws on his hands. Chris was terrified and screamed loudly. She suddenly woke up in her bed, realizing it was just a nightmare. Although it wasn't real, it felt connected to her dreams. The next day, Chris was at her college attending lectures when she was hit by nightmares again. Everything around her changed, all the students and the college blacked out, and the burned man from her nightmares appeared in place of the teacher. His face was so terrifying, and his sharp claws were capable of killing anyone. Chris screamed loudly, startling the other students, who were shocked by her outburst. She managed to compose herself and realized that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the world of nightmares. After the class ended, Chris hurried home, feeling deeply embarrassed after the incident in class. Upon reaching home, she found out that her mother, who was an air hostess, had gone to London for work and would be back in a few days. This left Chris feeling extremely alone at home. Therefore, she locked all the doors and windows to keep anyone from coming in. However, her ex-boyfriend, Jossie, managed to enter through a window. Jossie was genuinely worried about Chris, which is why he had come over. Chris explained to Jossie that she had been repeatedly experiencing nightmares, where the same dangerous man was trying to kill her. Jossie immediately reassured her that he was also having similar nightmares but advised her not to dwell on them and to stay calm. Chris convinced Jossie to stay with her, and they both slept comfortably in bed as if nothing had happened. By midnight, Chris heard her dog barking loudly. She quickly opened the door to check on her dog and found that it had been killed by someone with sharp claws. The only one outside was the burned man who had been tormenting her. Chris hurriedly ran inside and locked the door, but instead of being safe at home, she suddenly teleported to the school she had attended as a child. In front of her was her childhood version, who took her hand and said, "Let's play hide and seek." Chris was confused about where she had ended up and why these things were happening to her. As she entered a classroom, the burned man appeared in front of her, watching her intently and following her. However, in the real world, Chris's eyes opened. She washed her face in the bathroom and went back to bed, but now she saw that the burned man was lying beside her instead of Jossie. Realizing this, Chris screamed loudly, and Jossie tried to calm her down. But things took a turn for the worse, and Chris began to levitate uncontrollably, as if she was under someone's control. Jossie stood in shock, unable to manage the situation. Suddenly, Chris's entire body was marked with the same claw patterns, resulting in severe cuts all over her body. This meant Chris also met a tragic end. Jossie, who had initially not believed in these things, witnessed everything with his own eyes. Now, Jossie, terrified, ran straight to Nancy and told her that Chris had been killed. He expressed his fear that the same thing might happen to him, and he too might end up dead. Jossie explained to Nancy how the dangerous entity in their nightmares was killing them, and now it had even killed Chris. Nancy told Jossie that she, too, had been experiencing these nightmares, and the man in them was named Freddy. Freddy was trying to kill them in their nightmares, and if they died in these dreams and visions, they would also die in reality for some reason. Nancy stressed that they must keep this information secret from others and that Jossie should avoid sleeping at all costs, or he would also be in danger. After advising Jossie, Nancy tried to leave, but unfortunately, Jossie was captured by the police, who believed he had killed Chris. Jossie was quickly imprisoned until evidence could be found to prove his innocence. Meanwhile, Jossie's friend, Quentin, was shown. Nancy called Quentin and explained the situation, asking him to help gather evidence to free Jossie. Quentin went to a library to study the case with Nancy's help. While reading various books, Quentin noticed a child watching him strangely. Following the child into another room, Quentin encountered many other children, and it appeared that Quentin was now also connected to these nightmares. On the other hand, Jossie was being taken by a jailer to meet someone, but suddenly, the environment changed to what looked like an old factory where many children were held captive. As Jossie ventured further into the factory, he suddenly saw the man being referred to as Freddy. The burned man had killed all the people in the factory, and Jossie was terrified. Upon seeing the man, Jossie felt that perhaps remaining still might prevent the nightmare entity from harming him. However, this was a misconception. Suddenly, the dangerous, burned man inserted his sharp hand into Jossie's body and killed him completely. In reality, Jossie's death was discovered to have occurred when he jumped off his bed and fell into the sink, leading to his death. This news reached Nancy and Quentin, who were deeply distressed, fearing that their turn might be next. Nancy asked her mother if there was any connection between her, Jossie, and Quentin from their childhood. Her mother responded with a firm no and went inside the house. Nancy's mother then called an unknown person and mentioned that Nancy was starting to remember everything. Exhausted, Nancy decided to take a shower and set an alarm to ensure she wouldn't fall asleep, as sleeping was too dangerous and could cost her life. When Nancy emerged from her shower and entered her room, she found that it was covered in snow. The sudden snowfall shocked her, and she went inside to find answers to her questions. The entire place was covered in snow, and she eventually made her way to a school she had attended as a child. As she tried to open the door of the school, Freddy, the dangerous figure, appeared right behind her, looking menacing. He approached and touched Nancy. She stood completely still, fearing that any movement could result in her death. Just as Freddy was about to touch her, the alarm in reality started ringing, waking Nancy from her bath and pulling her back to reality. She got out of the tub, and Quentin called her, explaining how Jossie had died and that now only the two of them were left, fearing that they might be next. Both were extremely frightened and decided to meet up as soon as possible. Nancy shared with Quentin the details about the school she had seen in her visions. To her shock, Quentin revealed that he had also studied at that very school. Realizing this connection, Nancy invited Quentin to her house to look at some childhood photos. Eventually, Nancy found a photo that included pictures of all the students from the school she had attended. It was startling for them to discover that the photo included images of Dean, Nancy, Chris, Jossie, and Quentin, showing that they had all attended the same school. Moreover, there was a gardener named Freddy who had been very kind to the children and made them happy. When Nancy learned this, she went to her mother to ask more questions. Her mother explained that Freddy had indeed been the gardener at Nancy's school. Although Freddy had been liked by all the parents for taking good care of their children and keeping them entertained, some strange marks appeared on the children's bodies after some time. Parents began to suspect Freddy, and he was blamed for these occurrences. Despite the lack of evidence, Freddy was fired from his job and, upset, left town the next day. Nancy found some missing pieces in her mother's account and asked Quentin to investigate further. However, Quentin's father arrived and took him away, leaving Nancy to continue alone. Nancy, determined to uncover the truth, delved deeper into the information related to the photo. She discovered shocking details that all the children in the photo had died under mysterious circumstances. Nancy also found a video footage of a student talking about Freddy, mentioning that Freddy appeared in his nightmares and led him to a factory, suggesting that Freddy wanted to convey something. Meanwhile, Quentin was seen participating in a swimming competition at his school. As Quentin descended into the swimming pool, he suddenly felt someone pulling his leg down. When he emerged, he found himself inside a factory. Upon opening his eyes in the factory, he saw Freddy, who was hiding there, having run from the school parents and principal who were chasing him. When the parents discovered Freddy was inside the factory, they set the entire factory on fire. Freddy, who had tried to escape, was burned alive in the fire. Quentin was shocked by this sight and was soon pulled out of the water by others, recovering after a while. Quentin immediately went to Nancy to inform her of what had happened. He realized that Freddy had been brutally killed by the parents of the children Freddy had cared for, and it seemed Freddy was now trapped in a strange world, seeking revenge by killing those children. Quentin and Nancy decided to go to the basement of the school where Freddy used to stay. They set out for the school, but on the way, Quentin stopped at a supermarket to pick up some supplies. Nancy, who was in the car, began experiencing nightmares again, with the dangerous Freddy's presence haunting her. Terrified, Nancy went straight to Quentin in the supermarket. Afterward, they drove towards the school but encountered Freddy again, leading to a car accident. They barely escaped and decided to continue on foot. Nancy and Quentin were eager to uncover the mystery behind Freddy. They traveled to the school's basement, moving cautiously through the dark space. Inside, they discovered various items and pictures created by Freddy. Through these, they realized the truth. Freddy wasn't killing the children because their parents had killed him. Instead, he was targeting these children for a different reason. Even after his death, Freddy had not received justice, no one had believed him, and he was ridiculed. Nancy and Quentin decided that in order to defeat Freddy, they needed to bring him from the nightmare world into reality. Therefore, they had to fall asleep so Freddy could attack them, allowing them to trap him. Nancy decided she would go to sleep and bring Freddy into their world. Quentin was supposed to keep watch over her so he could wake her up if things went wrong. However, shockingly, Quentin himself fell asleep while keeping watch. Freddy appeared right in front of Quentin and began attacking him with his sharp claws, leaving deep wounds all over Quentin's body. Quentin fell unconscious and collapsed. Meanwhile, Freddy entered Nancy's nightmares, where he relentlessly attacked her. Despite the constant attacks, the location and surroundings kept changing. Nancy found herself back at her home, lying in bed, but Freddy didn't stop pursuing her. Nancy tried to escape, but Freddy used dark magic to transform the floor into a blood mire, trapping her. No matter where Nancy tried to hide, Freddy reached her and continued attacking, slowly causing more damage. In the real world, Quentin slowly regained consciousness. Seeing Nancy suffering, he tried to wake her up. Quentin had brought a special drug with him to prevent falling asleep, and he used it to wake Nancy. As Nancy returned from her nightmares to reality, she managed to catch Freddy, who was now physically present in their world. Freddy, in reality, was even more dangerous. Quentin and Nancy made every effort to kill Freddy. However, Freddy quickly injured Quentin and moved towards him to kill him. At that moment, Nancy came from behind and used a knife to cut off Freddy's hands. Before Freddy could do anything else, Nancy quickly slit his throat, killing him on the spot. Nancy and Quentin then set the entire place on fire to ensure Freddy would never return. Within a short time, they were rescued, and a team of firefighters arrived to extinguish the blaze. Both of them managed to escape safely, feeling relieved that everything seemed to be over, and that Freddy would not come back. A few days later, we see Nancy at home with her mother, everything appearing normal. But suddenly, Nancy sees Freddy in the mirror. She screams loudly, and Freddy, breaking the mirror, takes her mother away with him. And so, our story ends here.